Our first speaker today is Josephina, who's just going to give us a short snapshot of her personal experience and what kind of autistic identity means to her.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to stay for the whole panel, but I'm just going to speak for 5 minutes. Hi, my name is Josephina. I'm a former youth patron at Ambitious About Autism, and I'm starting a master's in medical history and humanities at York this year. So I thought of myself as different from about the age of 13, 14. I always had a sense that there was something off about me. And if I look at old journal entries, which is something that I've been doing a lot for kind of autoethnographic purposes almost, I've noticed that there are bits in which I say that there are things that I don't get quite right, and that I can never be like other people, that there's something, it's almost as if there was something that other people knew that I didn't, like a secret that for some reason everyone but me knew, which is not really what a secret is meant to be about. Like, that's not something that a large group of people are meant to know. I was taken to a psychiatrist when I was 14 because I had a developing eating disorder, and she diagnosed me with social anxiety as well, and depression. The depression I can kind of get because my brain was definitely kind of not correctly calibrated at the time, and I think it was kind of natural, not knowing that I was autistic, for my mental health to go downhill. But the social anxiety I never quite got, because it wasn't that I was scared of other people, or, well, yes, I was scared of the 10th graders, but that's a separate thing. It wasn't that I didn't want to make friends, it was that I didn't quite have the kind of the internal manual for me to make friends. And I just kind of ruminated on that quite a lot. But my psychiatrist insisted that it was social anxiety. And well, this went on for years, and she never really listened to me. But I'm starting to think that she deliberately did that, because there's so much stigma around autism. And whenever I spoke to my dad about getting a diagnosis, he would actually scream at me and say, "Well, you're not like those people, you're independent, you're intelligent," which are awfully ableist things to say, and don't acknowledge the fact that we have like a kind of uneven profile, spiky profile. There's no such thing as high and low functioning. And I guess it's quite tragic, but I was able to pursue an autism diagnosis once my dad died, because then I had nobody criticizing me, and I could openly discuss this. At the start of first year, I started feeling like I was fundamentally very different. Like it was more than just I am a bit odd. It was more like I am a faulty human being. I am an error in the matrix. I'm not supposed to be here. It was a very existential kind of dread. And again, my psychiatrist wouldn't listen to me. But then at that point, many people started saying, "I think you're autistic," especially because originally I was meant to be diagnosed with autism, but because I said this about my dad and my psychiatrist, I was diagnosed with dyspraxia, which still stands. But and then the more I looked into it, and the more friends I had to talk about it with, I can't remember how I made these friends, but the more I delved into it, the more I realized this is me, and I started allowing myself to be myself more outwardly. I gave myself permission to like the things that I like, even if they were deemed a bit childish. I gave myself permission to, just eat the same things every day, to be this level of intolerant about noise and smells. It was just me. It wasn't an error. It was the way that my brain was wired, and there was nothing wrong with it. And well, that was 6 years ago, and I remember exactly where and when I came out as autistic without necessarily having a diagnosis. But since then, I've done so much growing and so much, not just like acknowledging the basic things about autism, but also the things that I did struggle with that are not part of the criteria, like not understanding boundaries between people, and kind of figuring out the rules of friendship, the things that I might get wrong, things that were hurdles all throughout my childhood. And I'm at the point now in which I can happily joke about it, and I refuse to not disclose my autism, because it's so fundamentally part of me. I always like to say that every cell in my body is autistic. There's no me and my autism. There's no separation between the two. There's all of my thoughts, all of my feelings are autistic. It's the way that my brain is programmed. I know that a lot of people don't like the robot kind of metaphors, but I find them quite useful. And yes, that's basically it. It's really difficult to talk about this in 5 minutes, but I am at the point in which I'm very, very happy to be autistic. And even though there are things about me that I don't quite like, this is nowhere near the level of self-hatred that I used to have when I was a teenager. And it's all because I know that I'm autistic. So knowing that you're autistic, it's not like a kind of hindrance. It's not a death sentence. Learning that I was autistic was a relief. It was figuring a big secret out.
Thank you so much, Josephina. That was really moving. And I know I've heard you speak before, but every time I'm always very awed by your ability to put into words, I guess, what
well,
kind
that's
of
another thing autism has done for me. I was not a great public speaker before, but with ambitious about autism, I've kind of gained enough experience to do this and not be as scared as I would have been years ago.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think if you see in the chat, you can see other people. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stay for the whole thing in case you want to ask questions later.
Do stay. So our first speaker, our first research speaker, obviously, we have Josephine as a first speaker, is Amber. And Amber will be talking about her research into the experience of autistic mothers. So if you want to get set up, Amber, for us. Thank you. And I think Josephina just put her Twitter details in the chat. So if you do want to find a bit more about her or just listen to her wisdom more, you can use that. Right, over to you, Amber.
Can you hear me okay just before I start?
We can hear and see your slides fine.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the experience of autistic mothers that I completed for my thesis, and it's now been published, and I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. So why I decided to research this area, there's a real dominance of research into children's experiences, but we know that autistic adults have poor outcomes, and they also feel that their day-to-day lives are really under-researched. So why autistic mothers in particular? We know that parenthood has ups and downs for everyone. And we know that autistic adults have differential experiences with unique strengths and difficulties. So it would imply that there could be that difference in strengths and difficulties that are different to neurotypicals in parenthood. We also know that there's stereotypes from the definition of autism, which would imply that the experience of creating bonding and attachment with their child could be differential in some way. And there's very few research studies on this area. Of the ones that are out there, they're kind of quantitative, so looking at surveys and numbers, not really the experience of autistic mothers. and the 2 that have done that have been about one individual person's experience or asking autistic adults to imagine what that experience would be like. So what I did was utilise something called interpretive phenomenological analysis, which basically means I looked in depth at the experience of autistic mothers, looking at the similarities and themes that came out of their accounts of experiencing of parenthood, but also looking at any differences as well. So I carried out interviews which were Skype or face-to-face. I recruited from charities in Sheffield, Twitter, and the Sheffield Autism Research Lab. And in terms of the adverts that went out, the interview schedule, participant information, everything like that, there were 2 autistic parents that supported in making sure that things in that were written well and understood easily. And I interviewed 9 autistic mothers who had children between the ages of 5 and 15 years. So this slide just gives you a bit of information about the autistic mothers. They are pseudonyms here, but you can see that they were largely white British individuals and married, and that they all received their diagnoses of autism in adulthood. And they often had other physical health and mental health conditions that they felt didn't apply to them, similar to what Josephina was talking about earlier. And they felt after getting their diagnosis that actually autism was more relevant. In terms of the children, all of the children actually largely had an autism diagnosis. The 3 that didn't, one was undergoing assessment and they felt that the parent felt that they would have a diagnosis. One disagreed with the lack of diagnosis given for their child. And one had been diagnosed with developmental delay and trauma instead. And they were largely birth parents, but 2 had adopted children. So this is a summary of the themes that came out of the study, and I'll go through them one by one. So the first theme was that autism fundamentally impacts parenting. So whether it was that people related to their child also having autism or having other differences, such as developmental delay or trauma, they all spoke about that difference feeling like a shared bond and a special world that they had with their autistic or child that had additional difficulties. And they noticed similarities between themselves and noticed that they could actually support their child in a way that other family members couldn't, that they kind of got them, they understood them. And that led to a lot of strengths in their parenting, and it led to a lot of people going to them for help and support in generally for their own parenting. But it also led sometimes to some difficulties in terms of conflicting sensory needs, such as if a child wanted lots of hugs and they felt overloaded at that point in terms of touch, and also some guilt in terms of feeling that they'd passed on their autism in some way. It also, similar to what Josephina was talking about, a lot of the parents and mothers spoke about feeling that it was hard to tease out the autistic-y bits from the non-autistic-y bits, that they couldn't talk about parenting as an autistic mother as separate in some way, as that was just fundamentally part of them. But they said if they kind of had to, that it was kind of a normal experience, but maybe more amplified and intense. And there were particular areas that this seemed to come out in. So people spoke about a really increased empathy with their children, and that led to them often understanding them better, but sometimes feeling quite overwhelmed and drained. They also often had a special interest in people generally and family life, which meant that they were really good and really up to date on everything and research. They also were really good at planning and routine, say at certain times of being a parent. But also on the flip side, the unpredictable nature of being a parent was difficult, and the constant demands, and also the sensory sensitivity such as noise from the baby crying, but also sensory sensitivities during pregnancy were really difficult. A really big theme that came out was battle for the right support. So the mothers talked about feeling really misunderstood, judged and dismissed, especially by professionals. And the judgment might be positive. So sometimes it was that they were seen as really good at parenting and coping so well that they weren't listened to, but they were saying that this was a mask and people didn't understand that, and so therefore they got no support. They also spoke about how their feelings and needs and outward expression would be two very different things. So people would often misunderstand them. So they might say, I'm not coping, but seem like they were, or say, I am coping okay, but because people knew that they had autism, they might stereotype and say that actually they believed that they would be a bad parent in some way, so therefore did not provide help. And often the child's needs or autism were often dismissed, and everything was looked through a lens of being about the autistic parent. So in general, it all just felt like a battle and a fight and a stress for any support. And people also spoke about how understanding autism within the family unit was really key. So it was important to feel listened to and accepted, and that it was a difference, not the wrong way. And the professionals often struggled to think about how having an autistic parent with an autistic child or a child with other additional needs is a different dynamic, and that they looked at either the autistic mother or the autistic child or child with additional needs in kind of silos, which wasn't helpful. Other themes that came out were around development and acceptance. So people, as I mentioned, were diagnosed later in life, but they said that they felt like they'd been misdiagnosed, and suddenly after a while of having their diagnosis, they could start to self-accept that and incorporate that into their identity. That felt so helpful because they then felt in terms of their parenting, they could have permission to self-care, so permission to not be like neurotypical mothers and to maybe say, actually, I need quiet time now, and I therefore am going to take myself away and ask for some support for someone else to parent for a little bit, say a partner, for example. They also spoke about growth and adaptation. So someone said in the interview, autistic people aren't famous for coping well with change, but it is what it is, and you just have to kind of adjust as you go and you learn as you go. So actually people adapted and changed as they needed to. And they also learned that there was, again, self-acceptance there, because they realized there was nothing wrong with them, because actually their child they could often understand and be understood by, and that meant that they again could feel more accepting of their diagnosis. The final theme was the ups and downs of parenting. So a huge thing that came out was the intense connection, enjoyment and rewards of parenting. All participants spoke so much about the connection, bond or love that they had for their child, and how overwhelming that was and how strong it was. And they spoke about how it was the same strength or improved even further over time, and how they noticed it was reciprocal. So they noticed their child would come to them, that they enjoyed time with them too, that they had fun together. And they spoke a lot about celebrating achievements and being proud of their children. The final sub-theme of this, in terms of the downs of parenting, people actually spoke about how it was their children's needs and the impact on them around that was actually the most difficult thing. So it wasn't actually around their own autistic needs, but around their child's autistic needs, and that being a battle. So in terms of kind of some general themes and discussion from this, what came out is that overall there were lots of similar parenting experiences. So it was similar in terms of forming that bond and attachment, which contradicts stereotypes of autism, and that there was also similar themes in terms of increased stress during parenthood. There was also a huge support to move from this deficit narrative, such as disorder, to a different narrative, thinking about strengths and difficulties. And in terms of strengths, parents had real, often special interests. They were really prepared, they were really good at the routines, and people often went to them for advice on parenting. They also were so empathetic with their children, which was a real strength. They really got them, they understood them, but sometimes that had an overwhelming and draining impact on them, so it was difficult. And sometimes their sensory sensitivities meant they understood their child's sensory sensitivities, but was really difficult for them and could be overwhelming for them at times as well. A huge theme was the judgments and stigma are really common, and so there's been previous research that shows there's a lack of understanding in autistic individuals and stereotypes, but it also supports something called the double empathy problem, that rather than that autistic individuals might struggle to empathise, that it's actually there's a mutual misunderstanding between autistic individuals and neurotypical individuals. And this research supports that because it was largely neurotypical professionals misunderstanding the autistic mothers. And it also supports research on that children, mothers and fathers to children with autism themselves, found it as a battle of support for their child. So implications from this is that it's important to consider the whole family unit in services, adopt the narrative of difference rather than deficit, that it'd be important to have some groups for autistic parents to go to, and improve psychological support as well, and that we need more education on masking, sensory needs, double empathy problem, and that all of this will help improve stigma, improve misunderstandings for people. There were some limitations to this research, just that we didn't look at fathers' experiences, for example, and there's lots of scope for future research as well, which is more in the article which I can share. So there's also some references here which I can share as well.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Amber. And if you do want to put any links from the last page in the chat, please do. That'd be really helpful. So next up is Marion, who is dialing in. So I'll be sharing her slides for her, which is always easier said than done. Okay. Hopefully I can get this to work.
First of all, can I check, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, could you move to the content slide? A very brief overview, starting with, I'd like to divide things into sections. So starting with an overview of the project, very brief information on the methods used, moving on to a brief summary of the results, then talking in more detail about two strategies, the use of a trusted person and technology, and the last section is implications. Next slide, so starting the presentation proper, the project overview. And we had two research questions. The barriers experienced by autistic people and the strategies used to overcome them, understand social and other situations, and empower themselves. And the focus here is on the strategies. This was a 2.5-year project. Obviously, we came up with a lot of results and only focusing on some of them. An autistic-led project with most of the researchers autistic, and we found this was very helpful and that participants were more interested in being involved for this reason. And I should thank our funders, Drill Disability Research on Independent Living and Learning, for making this possible. Okay, moving on to the method. We used questionnaires, interviews, and diaries, where we were hoping people wouldn't write mainly about the strategies, but they wrote about their experiences, which were very interesting. The whole project team, there were 7 of us, participated and agreed the research protocols. This was a co-production process with a lot of the researchers, community-based autistic people employed by my university rather than academics. This has a lot of advantages, but also takes time, and there was quite a lot of learning for us to do. We also had an advisory board of autistic people which gave us advice on all aspects of the project, and we piloted the materials before we actually did the final data collection, and this led to some modification. Very brief statistical overview, section 3 project results. Well, not exactly a statistical overview, but a sort of brief summary of the results. We got 223 questionnaires, 21 interviews, and 9 diary exercises of varying length. These led to, after an analysis of a lot of different strategies, and also, unfortunately, a lot of barriers. And the focus here is on the strategies rather than the barriers, which are possibly more familiar to people, but obviously not all of them. We also found a few examples of good practice. This wasn't something we were specifically looking for, but we noted it when we found it because we thought this was important and something to learn from, and particularly person-centered, holistic approaches which looked as autistic people or a particular autistic person as a whole person with a variety of interest characteristics, needs and so on, rather than someone with autism sort of out there as a defining characteristic. Could you go on to next slide, trusted person? And this is the first of 2 slides, and I should have said in the introduction section that we're looking at the results through a lens of autonomy and empowerment. And autonomy is about being in a position to make decisions and having them implemented rather than having to do everything yourself. And this is particularly important in the context of a trusted person who can be seen as a support person who acts as an enabler to overcome some of the barriers the person would otherwise have encountered. And in our questionnaires, this was one of 2 most commonly used strategies, and it was used in a very wide range of different circumstances. We were, in terms of a questionnaire, there were certain situations we focused on, so that was obviously reflected in our results. But things like access to health services, job search and employment, benefits, social interaction, and access to services more generally. And there were a variety of ways people used the trusted person. Filling out forms was quite common, and explaining expectations and things like translating forms so they made sense to the autistic person. And this, the form role was things like employment, benefits, as well as other contexts. In a social context, the autistic participants generally found it easier to go to social situations with someone else who could explain things to them, and sometimes act as an intermediary, intervening situations. The comments on this were generally very positive, though there were some comments that participants, or some of them, felt themselves more socially acceptable if they had someone else with them, as that showed that other people were willing to socialise with them, and this is obviously something that needs to change. Also, a telephone version, in terms of making appointments, participants quite often asked another person to phone for them, to make appointments, and in some cases to discuss whatever the issue was. Next slide, please. So having a trusted or a support person could be misunderstood as dependence. And therefore we thought it's important to classify this as a strategy. And this does make a difference, because this is a choice of the person to involve someone else in order to overcome barriers and enable them to do things like participate socially, apply for jobs, access services that they would have found difficult or stressful to do otherwise. There were sometimes practical problems in finding a suitable person available, but this was much more a practical issue rather than an issue of dependence. Yeah, can we move on to the next slide, technology? So as well as getting support from a trusted person, participants also used technology. And in some cases, this was using technology instead of face-to-face interaction. So a lot of participants preferred to use technology to socialize. Online games were popular. Also the use of social media to socialize. And participants felt that this was just as valid and satisfying to them as face-to-face socializing was for some other people, and that if they weren't able to socialize online, they might not be able to socialize at all. There was also choice of which technologies to use, and generally a preference for email or sometimes text messaging or online forms as a strong preference to interacting by phone. Obviously, this wasn't everyone. Autistic people are very varied, but there is a strong preference amongst autistic people for asynchronous communication. So communication in your own time, where you don't have to respond immediately. And participants often found phone use quite stressful and confusing. And then this, of course, relates back to the previous session of where there weren't other options, trying to get a trusted person to make calls for them. It wasn't that they found email perfect. Some people found it quite draining to write emails, but that, or there could be delays in responses, so people might use phone occasionally, but there was definitely a preference for this type of communication, which was much more under their control. There was also a use of AAC's alternative and augmentative communication systems. There was only a small percentage of participants who were nonverbal, but some people use these systems occasionally, or sometimes quite frequently, at times where they felt stressed, or there was sensory overstimulation, or they were locked in for some reason and felt unable to communicate verbally. I think I should probably speed up a bit. I've got 2 more slides. So next one, technology, autonomy and empowerment. And this is, again, a strategy which increases participants' control. The communication use was particularly important as it gave access to things, it stopped people being excluded. There's unfortunately still some stigma around the use of alternative communication systems, which needs to be overcome. One of the participants who used these systems sometimes was a teacher, and obviously they used this in order to enable them to work. And this is my comment rather than something they said, but I just wonder whether this also had an important role for their students in overcoming stereotypes and showing someone who at least sometimes communicates non-verbally as a positive role model. So last slide, implications. I think these results are important, partly for showing some of the strategies autistic people use, but also in challenging stereotypes, particularly that autistic people are incapable, that they can't do things. And the fact that autistic people have strategies obviously shows that this isn't the case. There's also, of course, a need to overcome barriers, both to make things easier for autistic people and also to make it easier for them to use strategies. For instance, sometimes people objected to someone phoning on their behalf. So thanks for listening. I hope autistic people will be encouraged to think about their own strategies and how they can extend them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Marion. And do remember to put any questions you might have in the Q&A button at the bottom. Marion will be asking questions with Amber shortly. So we have our last speaker for this session unfortunately wasn't able to be with us today. So this is Eilidh Cage. and Eilidh will be talking about identity after an adult autism diagnosis and the relationships with psychological functioning and timing of diagnosis. So she's pre-recorded this. So I will share my screen successfully for a second time in a row, hopefully. Share sound, optimize video clip, screen to share. Hopefully you'll be able to see and hear this. I'll start from the beginning too.
Hello, my name is Eilidh Cage and I'm from the University of Stirling, and today I'm going to talk about our study about autism diagnosis, identity and psychological functioning. This project was conducted as part of Kirsten Corden's doctorate in clinical psychology, which she studied at Royal Holloway, University of London. Kirsten was supervised by myself and Rebecca Brewer, also from Royal Holloway. And just a quick note to say that this talk is pre-recorded as I'm currently on some beautiful windswept beach in the Outer Hebrides, and I'll share my contact details at the end of the talk so you can get in touch with me if you've got any questions about this presentation. Before we start, there's a few key terms I wanted to clarify first of all. So in this study, we were interested in personal identity. This is about your sense of who you are as an individual person, what makes me uniquely me. An autistic personal identity is about how you see autism making up a part of you. This is different to social identity, which is about how you identify with other autistic people and what makes you similar or what characteristics you share with other autistic people, which makes you different to other groups. And in this research, we looked just at personal identity. For diagnosis, we looked at recency, so how much time in years had passed since a formal diagnosis had happened, and the age as well that someone had been diagnosed at. We're also interested in self-esteem, which we can think of in terms of how we evaluate ourselves or the self-worth we apply to ourselves. Finally, we looked at well-being, which is a broad concept which takes into account both positive and negative aspects of mental health. So things like feeling sad or depressed, but also feeling mentally able to cope or process those feelings, for example. I'm sure many of you are more than aware that many autistic people experience barriers to receiving a formal autism diagnosis, which means that for some it's not until adult life that they get their diagnosis. Now, receiving an autism diagnosis can be life-changing, and people have to make sense of how that diagnosis fits with their sense of who they are and how being autistic makes them me. Now, as an adult, many people might have quite set ideas already of who they are, so they may have to reevaluate themselves in light of the diagnosis. If we look at prior research, which has mostly been qualitative interview studies, autistic people diagnosed in adulthood talk about an initially emotionally challenging period when they are first diagnosed. But actually, diagnosis is something that potentially helps them to understand themselves better in the long run. And if we look more broadly in the psychological literature, evidence suggests that having a positive sense of identity can link to more positive well-being and higher self-esteem. Prior research has also shown that a positive autistic social identity relates to higher well-being and self-esteem. But to the best of our knowledge, others haven't looked at that autistic personal identity and its relationships with well-being and self-esteem. So the broad aim of our study was to look at the relationships between personal autistic identity, so autism forming a unique part of me, and then timing of diagnosis and psychological health in terms of well-being and self-esteem. In terms of our hypotheses, first we predicted that being diagnosed at a younger age and more time having passed since diagnosis would relate to a more positive autistic personal identity. Second, we predicted that more positive autistic personal identity would relate to higher self-esteem and more positive well-being. We used a mixed methods online survey for this research. The survey included several pre-existing measures which had been created or adapted by others before. To look at personal autistic identity, we adapted a measure from the disability literature called the Questionnaire on Disability Identity and Opportunity, or QDIO. We used two subscales from this questionnaire. One was Autism Pride, which reflected perceived importance or pride in being autistic and autism being part of oneself. And then the exclusion/dissatisfaction subscale, which captured feelings of rejecting or being dissatisfied with being autistic. For diagnosis, we were most interested in the year diagnosed, so we could calculate how many years had passed since the diagnosis had happened, and then the age the person had been when they were diagnosed. For self-esteem, we used a well-established measure called Rosenberg's self-esteem scale, and for well-being, we used the Warwick-Edinburgh mental well-being scale. Both have been used before with autistic people and appear to be somewhat reliable, although I would say none of these measures are perfect. Additionally, we also included an open qualitative question where people could write as much as they liked in answer to the question, how did receiving an autism diagnosis affect how you think and feel about yourself? We used both open and closed questions to give us a deeper understanding of people's experiences. So who took part? Well, overall, we had 151 autistic people from the UK. We limited participation to the UK only, as diagnostic processes and experiences could very much differ all around the world. In terms of demographics, the majority of the sample were female, almost 78%, and the average age was 31, and most were white, were educated to degree level, and were currently working. So please take our findings with caution, as this sample is not representative. Regarding diagnosis, participants had been diagnosed between the years of 2000 and 2020 with a range of ages of diagnosis from age 6 to age 62, with a mean age of diagnosis at age 26, and almost 80% were diagnosed in adulthood. We didn't exclude people who had been diagnosed in childhood, as we still wanted to include their experiences. On average, participants had received their diagnosis almost 5 years before they completed the survey for us. Now I'm just going to whiz through our findings because of time, but I'll share a link at the end so you can read our findings in full if you're interested. So first, we found that as numbers of years since diagnosis passed, participants were less dissatisfied with being autistic. In other words, as time passed, they became more satisfied. We did not find a relationship with age of diagnosis. It seemed to be more about time passing since diagnosis. Secondly, looking at the relationships between autistic personal identity and psychological health, we found that greater pride in being autistic related to higher self-esteem, and lower dissatisfaction also related to higher self-esteem. For well-being, only greater dissatisfaction predicted lower well-being, and this was at a suggestively significant threshold, which means that this finding is a bit more statistically questionable, but nonetheless suggesting that some possible relationship between being more satisfied with personal autistic identity and more positive mental well-being. We also analysed all our open text box responses using content analysis to identify frequently mentioned patterns of experiences amongst our participants. For reasons of time, I'm just going to highlight the 3 most common categories of responses overall. So just to remind you, the question was, how did receiving an autism diagnosis affect how you think and feel about yourself? In response, most often people talked about an adjustment process, with responses generally reflecting changes experienced by the participants following diagnosis. They talked a lot about things like, the diagnosis led me to reevaluate my life. Some also talked about the emotions they felt, often saying things like, I felt relieved, but others also acknowledged that initially they felt upset, confused, and angry. The second most mentioned category we described as self-exploration, referring to the experience or process of self-discovery following diagnosis. Here, participants said things like how they understood themselves better, saying things like, I think the diagnosis has helped me more than not, as I know myself better. They also mentioned how they could be themselves, and how now they were letting myself be the real me. However, some people didn't really feel their self-views had changed that much following diagnosis, saying things like, I'm still not a very confident person, really. And I think it's important to acknowledge that receiving the diagnosis is not an instant fix for everything and contains a range of different emotions and experiences. Finally, the third most reported category centred around learning and support needs, where participants reflected on a lack of information or knowledge about autism following their diagnosis. They mentioned their own preconceptions about autism before and after receiving the diagnosis, and discussed finding out more about autism by doing their own research, especially doing that online. Participants also talked about how they would have benefited from more support post-diagnosis, noting, for example, that it was frustrating that there was nobody to help me through, and how they weren't given much information once diagnosed. For example, someone said, "They didn't really tell me very much about my diagnosis, so for years I thought that being autistic meant having meltdowns and being crap at human interaction." Now, it's worth noting a few limitations and future directions from this research. As mentioned, our sample was not representative. Participants were recruited online and mostly featured female experiences. We know, though, that many autistic females are late diagnosed, and our study still adds some knowledge around their experiences. There are also limitations in the measures that we use and how some were adapted from the disability literature, as there wasn't a specific measure that looks at autistic personal identity that we are aware of that hasn't been adapted from non-autistic measures. So it would be valuable to have measures which are specifically designed with autistic people to look at autistic personal identity. Additionally, as our survey was a one-off, it would be useful to have longitudinal studies which look at experiences over time, especially capturing the experiences of people who are seeking or thinking about an autism diagnosis and how they make sense of their identity as they go through the diagnostic journey. It's also clear that more support is needed post-diagnosis, and we need to see more autistic-led support. There's been some great work in this area, and we need to see and do more. So what are the key points to take away here? First, that time passing rather than the age you get diagnosed seems to be more important for identity conceptualization after a diagnosis. This makes sense if we think about how time can be valuable for allowing people to think and process things. Second, we've provided more evidence for the positive relationship between autistic identity and mental well-being and self-esteem. To the best of our knowledge, our study is the first to look at this in terms of personal rather than social identity. Finally, we know that more high-quality information and support is needed post-diagnosis, especially support that acknowledges and prioritizes well-being and helps people to freely explore their autistic identity and learn from other autistic people. Thank you for listening, and huge thanks to all of our participants. This research has recently been accepted for publication, and you can read the preprint now at sciarxiv.com/4NS83. If you've got any questions, the best way to get in touch is to email me at eilidh.cage@stir.ac.uk.
Thank you for that. And I apologise for all the musical watch next things popping up on my YouTube. That is very on brand for me. So now we have a Q&A with Amber and Marion. Obviously, Eilidh is unable to join us because she is off in a very picturesque place. So if Amber and Marion, you can confirm that you're with us.
Yeah. Can you hear me? This
Yeah,
is
we can
Marion.
hear you fine. Thank you. Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can see you and hear you. Brilliant. So the first question I'm going to ask is something we ask all our speakers, and Amber, I'll put it to you first. And it's just what kind of led you to study this kind of topic for your research?
So I've done a lot of support work and also worked as an assistant psychologist in an autism service as well. And I think that led me to realise there really wasn't much research on autistic adults out there. So when it came to choosing a topic for my thesis, that's an area I wanted to look into more. And I was really surprised when I was just generally looking at the literature that there was a lot on autistic children and then on transitions to uni, but not really anything on people's experiences going through, I suppose, kind of normal experiences of adult life, like having a family. So I think that was the main motivation, really, that I wanted to look into that more because it hadn't really been done before.
Brilliant, thank you. And Marion, what about yourself?
Okay, I mean, I have a very interdisciplinary research background, but in terms in terms of this particular research, I'd attended a one-day event organised by the Scottish Autism Research Group, and I'm not meaning to be generally critical of this because it does do some useful work. But afterwards, I had some conversations with some of the other autistic participants, and we felt that there was a lot of focus on interventions, but not a lot of focus on autistic people and and our perspective in things. At the same time, I've become aware of the drill funding, and I met up with a couple of the other autistic, one of the autistic participants at the conference and another autistic person, and we decided we'd submit a grant proposal to this research call from Drill, and again, thanks to Drill who made the research possible. And we went through a brainstorming process where we came up with a lot of ideas. We then discussed them and refined them. And this was over a process of several meetings. And we came up with the idea of strategies and barriers. I should also say, which maybe didn't come out, but the work was with autistic adults, not autistic children. I can't remember whether we discussed that explicitly, but it's again the sort of reasons Amber stated.
Sorry, that's me. Thank you. That is, a really interesting insight in how you got to where you are. So some questions about your research now. Amber, I'll go for one for you first. From your findings, do you think that a parenting class, skill class, with kind of a peer-to-peer mentoring element which involves autistic adults would be helpful?
Yeah, so the autistic mothers spoke about how they felt that all the, I suppose, parenting groups out there didn't feel like they met their needs, like baby groups and things. They didn't feel like they could always relate to the mothers going to those groups, and they said it'd be great if there were groups actually where it was with other autistic mothers. So I think that would be a really good idea, and I think it's important to come from the autistic community as well, because they know best what it is that would be useful for them, and I think those spaces would be really helpful, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Another question, obviously your research focuses on autistic mothers. Was that by choice, or were these, I guess, did you only come across autistic mothers in your research?
So it was originally open to fathers as well, and some did get in touch but then didn't actually go ahead with the interviews. So I think it'd be really important to look into the experience of autistic fathers and see if there's any similarities and differences there. It was open to them, but no one participated.
Brilliant, thank you. Marion, a question for you. So how can the results of your research be applied in a way that looks at how non-autistic people interact with autistic people? Are there kind of key messages that you want people to take away around that?
I suppose partly from my research and partly from my own experiences. I think there's a need for non-autistic people to be a lot more flexible. There's a sort of false dictum that autistic people aren't emphatic, they're bad at communication, and non-autistic people are good at all of these. But then it's autistic people who are supposed to change and communicate in ways that don't work for for them. So I think there's a need for non-autistic people to be open to doing things differently, to be more flexible, and to value diversity. So, yes, sorry, I'm just thinking on my feet. I mean, obviously, the other aspect of this is barriers. We came up with quite a lot of barriers, which I didn't talk about here. And some of this is overcoming the barriers. One of the points on the slides I didn't mention was things like the deficit approach to autistic people, which even unfortunately appears in a lot of research, and some of our group, when we did our literature survey, so I even found it actually quite depressing reading all this stuff about ourselves, which was very negative. The idea that autistic people are totally incapable, and if you can do something or you have some sort of life, you can't possibly be autistic. And unfortunately, some people involved in diagnosis have that sort of perspective, and it can act as a barrier to diagnosis. So there needs to be, a change in attitudes to autistic people, not seeing us all as savants and having special abilities, but equally recognizing that we have capabilities, that we can do a wide range of things, we're very diverse, but also that we often need a bit of support in order to achieve our full potential, and that we need to be accepted for who we are rather than trying to fit us into some sort of mold. And, things like providing written forms of communication which don't have to be answered immediately, including email addresses, because a lot of our participants liked online forms, but sometimes they can also be difficult. So generally doing things to overcome barriers, not expecting autistic people to behave identically to non-autistic people.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marion. I'm going to fit in one more question before the break, which is a really interesting question. And Josephina, if you're still with us, do you feel free to chip in verbally or in chat? Because I think it is one which... So this question is for all of you, as I just said, and it's about someone who works in autism assessment services. And they've kind of noticed in the last couple of years there's a move from precise diagnostic pathways and getting maybe a precise diagnosis of autism or ADHD or dyslexia separate, and getting kind of more of a focus around their individual needs and strengths and putting in support that reflects those. And this person was kind of wondering, this could almost take away the need for diagnosis and just focus on the person's kind of profile, and what you kind of feel how you feel this fits with kind of the importance of diagnosis on identity and making sense of experiences. So Amber, I'll come to you first. Do this kind of come across in yours at all?
So I suppose it relates, to the idea of moving from the deficit to the differences narrative, and that fits really well with that. And I think it would be really in line with that, and actually supporting meeting people where they're at and seeing things as you know, what are your strengths, what are your difficulties, and let's put support in there. And that would be, I think, a really useful way forward. And I think it would also support people to, especially in this context that they've described, it could help in terms of a lot of practical issues, that people get support before needing a diagnosis, which would be really helpful. I think the con of it, in terms of what came out of my research, is that people did find, I suppose, at some point having the diagnosis a useful process to give them a sense of acceptance and understanding for themselves. So I think it should be really interesting to hear from the autistic community what they feel would be best in terms of that, and maybe it'd be some kind of combination of doing that initially to get support in their preventative and then later having a diagnosis. I don't know, but yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what the autistic community feel about that.
Thank you. Josephina, not that we're expecting you to answer on behalf of all autistic people ever, but I was wondering if you had anything to kind of, what your initial thoughts around this area?
I think it's okay to treat people in a way that feels kind of equitative, and to make us feel as though we're not highly different from so-called the norm. But at the same time, I think it's a danger to the sense of identity that we've fostered as a result of being different. And well, a lot of people like to argue that a label is harmful, and they only see autism as a label, the diagnosis as a label. And I think that's a reason why, well, one of the reasons why my psychiatrist at the time didn't want to diagnose me, because like she thought I was obsessed with labels. But actually labels help you make sense of yourself, and they help you kind of gain pride in yourself. Because I think without the label autistic, I would have just, like, who knows whether I would have been able to kind of feel a sense of weird girl pride. Like that's not really a thing, is it? And I think I would, like, as much as I enjoy being alone and I enjoy solitude, I don't think I would have tolerated that feeling as isolated and alien from the rest of the world as I did when I was 20, 19, up until when I was like 20 years, 11 months. Now, I think it's a detriment for autistic people to ignore, to kind of forgo the diagnoses, and to forgo the importance of diagnosis. It really doesn't take us into account.
Brilliant, thank you. And Marion, what about you? I know your research kind of refocused on autonomy and empowerment. So did this come up at all?
Okay, in our questionnaire, and I haven't looked up the actual wording, we had some demographic data, and this included whether people had a diagnosis or were self-diagnosed or both. And I think we got some comments that some people did prefer to self-diagnose, that they didn't necessarily want someone else to stick a label on them. And I think at one point we did look and see if there were any differences, and we found there weren't specifically, so we just analysed the everyone, whether formally diagnosed, self-diagnosed, or quite a lot of people were seeking a diagnosis. I think identity is useful. We all put labels on things. Sometimes, sort of objects is just a way to refer to them. I mean, I have a whole lot of labels, and I want to my sort of coming out process where I go through all of them. It can be helpful for people meeting up with other people in the same group, where there is a potential for some commonality, but obviously, being autistic isn't sufficient for getting on with another person. Other aspects of commonality can be more important. It's again whether for this identity, some people need or prefer to have a label from a formal diagnosis from a professional. Some people prefer to diagnose themselves. The other aspect of this is access to support. And obviously, if you have a process which identifies support needs, then yes, you presumably, hopefully get the support you need. Currently, though it shouldn't necessarily be the case, you often need some sort of formal diagnosis in order to get support. So I find, I'd self-diagnosed a long time ago. I resisted the idea of formal diagnosis, and then I went along and got one because I wanted some reasonable adjustments at work. And there are also issues of how the Equality Act legislation, which gives the entitlement to support works, where it's unfortunately quite a medical model definition, which could usefully be changed. It would be useful if in all contexts, people, or obviously for children, their parents were, and also the child or young person could say what support they need, and there would be a process of ensuring that they actually got this support, which doesn't necessarily happen at present.
Yes.
And it's sort of current society and how best we transform it, including for autistic people.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marion. And thank you all for answering questions, especially the last one. I know the issues around identity, diagnosis, self-diagnosis is pretty much kind of a big hot topic of autism, and probably not just autism. So I appreciate you answering that. So yeah, thank you so much to our speakers for the first half. We're now going to go on break. So we'll return at 11:55. We'll have a 7-minute break instead of 10, if that's all right with everyone, where we'll move on to our final 3 speakers. So I'll see you then. Thank you. So we have our next 4 speakers for the 3 speakers for the second half of this session. And first up is Louise Kirby. And Louise will be talking about the knowledge of autism gained by learning from people for a local UK Autism Champion network. So Louise, if you want to join us.
Thank you. I'll try and share my slides. I practiced and it worked perfectly, but I'm not very confident. It won't work this time. Looking hopeful.
Yeah, almost there.
Yes, can you see that okay?
Yep, see and hear you fine, thank you.
Perfect, thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all about gaining knowledge through an Autism Champion network. Autism champions in this context are people who work with autistic people and want to improve what they and their services do to meet autistic need. So almost all are neurotypical, but there are some autistic autism champions as well. So I'll set the scene to start with. Like the Autism Act 10 years on, when we 3 or so years ago were co-producing our autism strategy, we were hearing lots of negative experiences, sadly, from autistic people in accessing services. And there's a quote here from one of the autistic adults in a workshop saying that generally professions aren't really understanding why autistic people behave as they do. And we have the Oliver McGowan mandatory training, which is far, far further on than at this time, when I don't think even the partners had been identified or made their bids yet. And also it was before the core capability framework for supporting autistic people came out too. But we in Northamptonshire felt that something needs to be done. We want to do something practically to resolve this and improve experiences for autistic people. So we set up our Autism Champion Network, and that was with the idea that we would all have a shared understanding of autism across organisations, so there's clarity and consistency, and we would meet monthly as a community to share knowledge. So the network is a non-hierarchical range of professionals, and these are the autism champions, and they work across organisations. So we're breaking down organisational barriers. To start with, we only had about 10 of us, and we were from health and social care, deciding that this is what we wanted to do. And we decided between us what our vision would be and our mission statement, and created terms of reference. At the time of this research, there were 60 autism champions about. Now there's well over 100, and the organisations represented are education, police, commissioning, advocacy, all sorts of different organisations come together as part of this network. And we agreed that our vision would be simply to improve experiences for autistic people and their families across our county. So all these professionals, they might be quite high up in their organisation, or they might not. We have support workers, consultants, psychiatrists, people up in commissioning and things like that. But within the network, we're all absolutely equal. Everybody's experiences are different and are valued. As equal partners in this, an integral part, no difference, are the Autism Advisory Panel members, and these are people with lived experience of autism. The majority autistic themselves, but some are parents of autistic youngsters. One or two are parents of autistic youngsters. There are also autistic parents with autistic youngsters. So we have quite a range of people, and within the Autism Advisory Panel members, we've got a range of ages, students, people in employment, people not employed, retired people, male, female, someone in transition. So quite a lot of different experiences of life and of accessing services. So my study was an evaluation, and it was to inform further development of the network by answering those two questions. But importantly, there's two important things really. Autism champions aren't there because they've been nominated and told you've got to go and be an autism champion on the network now. They're there because they want to be there, which creates a genuine sincerity in wanting to improve experience for autistic people. So and equally so are the Autism Advisory Panel member. And we come together monthly with the opportunity to learn more or broaden our knowledge of autism. And there are presentations and also the opportunity to network with others. Things are a little bit different now, of course, because we're doing it all virtually. When the evaluation took place, we were still face to face. Having the Autism Advisory Panel and Autism Champions together as equal partners, I don't want you to think that it is all polite agreement. The Autism Advisory Panel members are there to challenge. We're there to get to know each other as people and understand each other's needs and barriers. So it can be a bit of a bumpy ride, but that's the purpose, because we want to make change. So it's a qualitative study. At the time, as I mentioned, there were about 60 autism champions, and I thought I'll batch 16 to 60 groups of 16 email and ask people if they would like to participate with the information about what that would involve. 6 participants came forward in the first batch, which was absolutely brilliant, all connected with learning disability. I don't know if that's interesting in itself. And there wasn't anybody outside learning disability, so I did purposefully recruit a further participant, just so we get a bit more of diversity in the data. All these participants are from health and social care. There was a clinical psychologist from the Children's Learning Disability team, a nurse from the community team for learning disabilities, a nurse from intensive support team, a provider, manager of a provider, which was a really interesting view as well, and psychologist from the adult autism team, and a clinical assistant. So there was sort of a varied views and knowledges, though I would say all the knowledge, if we're referring to core capabilities framework, these would be tier 2 and tier 3 level. I set up and administer the Autism Champion Network, so obviously I've got a huge amount invested in this, so my positionality, I had to reflect really, really carefully on that, and I asked a colleague outside the network to check the interview questions to make sure that I wasn't including leading questions, and she also checked my analysis as well to see if the themes that I was coming up with she agreed with, and that was all the same, apart from she picked up that a lead coordinator was another theme that was coming out. Ethical approval from the University in Northampton and from the Northampton Health Foundation Trust, who is my employer. So as I mentioned, we have these presentations, and the idea was that Autism Champions would take these presentations and then deliver them, disseminate that information out to their teams, so the knowledge would cascade out. That's how I thought that it was going to be working. But there was a strong theme that came out of this study was that the knowledge that was most valued and shared wasn't knowledge of autism, wasn't knowledge from these presentations, but linking with other professionals outside their own sector and using them, bouncing ideas and asking questions and getting different perspectives and signposting was really, really useful. And the most of all, I think, came out was that having autistic individuals present as part of this, an equal part of this, developing understanding more of what it is to be autistic and listening to the day-to-day difficulties one has as autistic in a neurotypical world was really powerful for these professionals, and building a relationship with autistic people outside the therapeutic was very powerful, and people had an emotional response. So really interesting when thinking about how we develop knowledge of autism and how we make a difference in services. The other important thing that came out was sharing resources. So essentially, it was about sharing knowledge through people, learning through people that came out. So the implications and conclusion, the benefits from learning from people was a strong, or the strongest theme. It was a evaluation, so it's not supposed to be generalized, but it is an interesting point, I think, and it could have implications when thinking of training and whether, as an adjunct to a traditional training at sort of levels 2 and above, using this social networking or being part of an autism champion network such as this could be a helpful adjunct to just get a different perspective and knowledge of autism. And we know that social networking is a valued or way of building knowledge through interactions with others and collaboration, making connections and sharing of ideas. So it is a valid method of learning as well as the more didactic. We've got some quotes there of what Autism Champions said within the interviews about the usefulness of having other people to learn from and the autistic people themselves. So as well as that implication for training, I think there's helpful pointers for people who want to set up an Autism Champion network like this one. And the service users are equals, and as this Autism Champion is saying, that they are vocal, and as I've mentioned, they do challenge, and it makes it more real that it's not just a tick box exercise, but we are actually learning from each other. Yes, and underlines the importance of collaboration with autistic people and learning from autistic people. So I think I was so worried about time, I've gone terribly quickly. So hopefully you'll ask me lots of questions and I can fill in the gaps. And I've also put my contact details there as well if you wanted to know more about this Autism Champion network and the knowledge disseminated from it and how it makes a difference for people in services, to inform them and how they can reasonably adjust, as I think Marion was saying, changing attitudes to autistic people by being part of a network.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. And do remember to put any questions you have for Louise or other speakers using the Q&A button or in our chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So our next speaker is Charlotte, and Charlotte is going to be looking at autistic adolescents during COVID. So that's not your real title. You can say your real title.
No problem. So I'm just going to share my slides here. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, we can see that fine.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you very much. So hi everyone, thank you very much for having me this afternoon. My name's Dr. Charlotte Huggins. I'm from the University of Edinburgh, working with Generation Scotland. And here I'm going to talk to you today about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on autistic adolescents in Scotland. So I'm sure you'll all agree that the pandemic and lockdown has had some effect on basically everyone on the planet at this stage, and it has had an effect on health and well-being. However, while everyone has been affected, not everyone will be affected in the same way. Not everyone has the same resources, not everyone has the same background, and not everyone has the same pre-existing health. You may have heard the saying, we are all in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. And that is why I'm particularly interested in looking at autistic people, because they may well be particularly or differently affected by the pandemic. And there's some emerging evidence that autistic people may be more negatively affected. And survey of autistic adults found that 93% reported some type of negative impact on at least one area of their life. Another study looking at psychiatric admissions 3 months before and 3 months after lockdown found that admissions increased for autistic adults after lockdown, and this was only one of 4 patient groups for whom this was true. Parents have also reported an increase in challenging behaviours, such as self-injury in their children, and almost half of parents report that their autistic children are having difficulties understanding and following the COVID-19 measures. But it may not be all bad. There may be some reasonable benefits for the pandemic and the pandemic measures. In another survey of autistic adults, around half reported feeling overall better in lockdown compared to pre-lockdown. And many have argued that many of the COVID-19 mitigation measures, such as social distancing, the greater accessibility of education and employment online, may also serve to make the world more autism friendly. So some have argued that this may be really a golden opportunity to create alternate ways to access support, education, employment, and socialization for autistic people that are more accessible in the long term. But there's still quite a lot of questions to answer about this. First of all, a lot of the work based on young people and children is based on parent report. So we're not really getting the story directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And much of this work doesn't really have non-autistic comparison groups. So it's hard to assess if the findings we see are really anything to do with autism, or if this is just how everyone has been affected by the pandemic. And there's still relatively little work on adolescents. But the good news is that Generation Scotland's Teen COVID Life project can plug many of these gaps. So in doing this project, there were 3 questions I really wanted to address, which I'll be talking about here. First of all, what is the overall impact of the pandemic on autistic adolescents? For instance, are autistic adolescents more likely to be overall negatively impacted or positively impacted? Second of all, do autistic adolescents feel more stressed about COVID-19? And finally, are autistic adolescents following the COVID-19 guidance, in this case, social distancing and wearing masks in public places? But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about what Generation Scotland is. So we are a family cohort study. That means we collect a wide range of data on many, many people. In our case, we collect psychological, genetic, and health information. The thing about cohort studies is they're not designed to address any one specific research question. A lot of data is collected so many different researchers can address many different research questions in their data. And in April 2020, Generation Scotland pivoted to doing a lot of this work, particularly on the effect of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And one of these projects was, of course, Teen COVID Life. So these were a series of surveys designed to give young people aged 12 to 17 in Scotland a voice to tell us how they are feeling, coping, and adapting during the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of the reason this came about was because there wasn't that much work early on in the pandemic looking at how adolescents and young people were affected. So far we've done 3 surveys. There was survey 1, which took place early in the pandemic during the first national lockdown. Survey 2, which was in summer of 2020 after lockdown measures eased and COVID-19 numbers were relatively small. And survey 3, which actually only finished 2 weeks ago. So for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on survey 2, because that is where we have data about autistic people. Now, I'd like to stress that Teen COVID Life was not a project looking specifically at autism. It was a general health and well-being project that autistic people were able to join in with. And in survey 2, they could tell us whether or not they were autistic. So in Teen COVID Life Survey 2, we had 80 autistic teens take part, which is a relatively small sample, but the advantage of using cohort work like this is that we had a relatively large number of neurotypical controls to draw comparisons. So I used a technique called nearest neighbor matching to match participants on age, sex, gender, trans status, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. So I matched 80 neurotypical teens to our 80 autistic teens, with the thought that the main difference between these two groups should be whether or not they are autistic as well. So the first thing I wanted to find out was overall, what is the impact of the pandemic, which we addressed through this question in Teen COVID Life. The participants could select one of the 5 options below, and I grouped this into positive, neither positive or negative, or negative. So this bar chart here shows the percentage of participants reporting each type of impact. As you can see, overall, more autistic teens reported a negative impact and fewer reported a positive impact compared to matched controls. However, when I looked at this statistically, this difference was not significantly different when accounting for other characteristics, such as socio-demographic factors. So overall, autistic teens aren't really more likely to be positively or negatively pandemic on the whole. But this is really a sort of large-scale comparison. Let's look at it in a little bit more detail. So let's look at stress about COVID-19. As before, we asked all the participants this question, and they could select one of the below answers, including prefer not to answer. After excluding prefer not to answer, this is the percentage of participants reporting feeling stressed about COVID-19 most or all of the time. And you can see in the donut plot here that over a quarter of the autistic volunteers reporting feeling stressed about COVID-19 most or all of the time, compared to much fewer of the matched controls. And when I examined this statistically, this difference remains significant. So this suggests that autistic teens are more likely to be stressed about COVID-19. And in particular, when you look at different types of worry and how these predict stress, they were more likely, for both groups, worry about the future was a significant contributing factor for stress. And finally, I wanted to look at, I wanted to look at how autistic teens were following the COVID-19 guidance. In the overall Teen COVID Life project, we found that there was actually quite high adherence to mask use and social distancing measures in our participants. But I wanted to see how this looked when we compared the two groups. So first of all, we asked about use of face coverings on public transport and in shops. And participants could select one of the below options. And they could also select, I don't go on public transport or in shops. So looking first at those who were avoiding public transport and shops entirely, something really interesting emerged. While about 14% of the autistic teens were avoiding public transport and shops entirely, none of the matched controls were, and only 3% of the full survey were. So the autistic teens seem to be much more likely to be avoiding shops and public transport entirely. Now, with the data we have, it's really hard to say if this is a product of the pandemic or if this is a difference that would have been present before the pandemic. But let's put a little pin in that one for now, and I'll get back to it later. After we'd excluded people who were avoiding public spaces entirely, this is what we found. This is the percentage of participants who were always wearing a face covering in shops and on public transport. While more of the matched controls were doing so, again, when we tested it statistically, the difference was not really significant. So what does this mean pulled together? First of all, autistic teens were equally likely to be using masks, but they were less likely to be going into shops and public transport that would require using a mask in the first place. Now let's talk about social distancing. So this is maintaining your 2 meters of distance from people outside of your household in public spaces. Participants could select one of the below options to this question. And this is what we found. So this shows the percentage of participants always maintaining social distancing with people outside of their household. Now you can see here the autistic teens, considerably more of them are always doing this. And when we examine this with an ordinal logistic regression, we found this difference remains statistically significant. So what does this mean? Overall, autistic teens were actually twice as likely to be following the social distancing guidance compared to our neurotypical controls. So what does this all mean pulled together? Well, first of all, while there doesn't seem to be any difference in the overall impact of the pandemic on autistic teens were generally more stressed about COVID-19, and worries about the future contribute to this stress for both groups. So these teens may benefit from more help and resources about COVID-19 and with planning for their future. Second of all, we found that autistic teens were actually following the health guidance well. So they were taking the pandemic seriously, they were using face coverings, and they were maintaining social distancing. But more were avoiding shops and public transport entirely. Now, bear in mind, this is from a survey in summer 2020 when the COVID-19 numbers were relatively low and restrictions were relatively loose. So while much more research is required to be definitive about this does suggest to me we might have a risk of some overcaution. So autistic teens may also benefit from support with easing out of the COVID-19 restrictions. So what is my overall take-home message? First of all, again, autistic youth are taking the pandemic seriously and they are following guidance. But they may also be struggling with stress and with easing out of lockdown. More long-term support for managing the uncertainty caused by the pandemic and the stress of COVID-19 and planning for their future may help young people, both autistic and not, thrive in the post-COVID world. And I would like to leave you with 3 key messages that emerged for me in doing this research. Firstly, that we should celebrate autistic success, such as in adapting to and responding to the COVID-19 guidance, support where there are challenges, such as in managing COVID-19 stress, and never assume or underestimate the capacity of the autistic community. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the session.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Charlotte. That's really interesting. And yeah, as we said in the chat, do let us know if you've got any questions using the Q&A button, and I'll go through those afterwards. So now we have our last speaker of the session, which is Themis. And he will be talking about attitudes towards autism in British tabloids.
Hello, I'm Dr. Themis Karaminis. I'm a senior lecturer at Hill University. And today I would like to talk about a research project carried out by a research team and entitled Implicit Attitudes Towards Autism in the British Press. This project is funded by a British Academy Leverhulme Small Research Grant awarded to Kostas Gabrielatos and me. Autism acceptance, feeling accepted, is crucial for the successful integration of autistic people in education, work, and society. It has a significant impact on mental health, and it is also central to the neurodiversity movement. But how accepting is British society towards autism and autistic people? This project addresses this question through the lenses of the press. The press reflects and constructs and reconstructs public views, attitudes, and beliefs. It is not only what is reported about autism in the press, what is newsworthy about it. It is also an issue of the language used, the actual words and the syntax that the authors choose, consciously or subconsciously, to describe the same thing. Both the press's choice of content and language may perpetuate perceptions and biases and influence implicit attitudes about autism and autistic people. There exists some important work on the representation of autism in the press. For example, a recent study by Lewin and Akhtar demonstrated a gradual shift from deficit-based views of autism towards neurodiversity-based accounts in the Washington Post newspaper. For the British press, there are 2 studies which combined cover the period between 1983 and 2008. In this project, we aim to extend this work to the last decade. The project has 3 main aims. The first aim is to create a corpus, a digital database of all autism-related articles from the British newspapers for this period. The second aim is to use corpus linguistics to chart the representations of autism in autistic people. We are interested to monitor changes over time, as well as differences between individual newspapers, for example, differences related to the style of reporting or political orientation. A third aim is to translate our findings into recommendations for better reporting about autism in the press and to practices and policies fostering positive autistic identity. This will be done through participatory autism research. I would now like to say a few words about the corpus linguistics methodologies that we use in this study. We employ corpus-based critical discourse analysis, or corpus-based CDA. So this is a mixed method which employs quantitative and qualitative components from the fields of corpus linguistics and critical discourse analysis. The main assumption is that statistical patterns in the occurrence of particular words or grammatical structures uncover attitudes and biases of the authors towards individuals, groups, or concepts. Now, this holds even if authors are unaware of these attitudes or if they consciously try to obscure them. And we use corpus-based CDA to construct emergent representations for targeted terms. This involves 4 interconnected analyses. The first 2 analyses involve identifying co-occurring words with the terms in focus. The second analysis is about grammatical constructions. The third analysis is about meanings. And the fourth analysis takes into account context. There are technical terms for these analyses. We will refer to one of these, collocation, later on in this presentation. Our first step was, of course, to create the corpus that was used in this study. This was done using the ProQuest newsletter database, which we searched with an appropriately constructed query, which included broader terms than autism and autistic, for example, terms like neurodiversity on the spectrum or ASD. We downloaded all relevant articles and pre-processed them to remove duplicates. So after this, we came up with a corpus of 24,000 autism-related articles. So the proportion of these articles per newspaper are shown in this pie chart. We were also interested to look at the percentages of articles referring to autism in each newspaper and how this changed over years. So there was a small percentage of articles referring to autism. However, there was a slight but constant trend for increases. Now, this was present in all newspapers, but it was especially pronounced in 4 broadsheets: Independent, Observer, the Daily Telegraph, and the Guardian. There were also considerable differences in the representation of autism in individual newspapers, especially in the later years. So in 2020, 1 per 100 articles referred to autism in Independent, but this number is much lower in some other newspapers. Let us now look at the words that co-occur with the terms autism. So as we discussed earlier, these friend words, which are referred to as collocates, are thought to reflect or lend some of their meaning to the terms in focus. Collocates are derived through measurements and through statistical calculations that ensure that they are strong and they are reliable. And collocates are also examined in the context in which they appear. In our analysis, we used collocates to construct emergent representations for autism. So in the remainder of this presentation, we will discuss these emergent representations and focus on 2 important features of these, namely the third-party account and the gender bias. So according to collocates in the British press, autism is a spectrum, disorder, condition, and disability, rather than a different way of perceiving the world. Autism presents difficulties, problems, special needs, issues, and challenges. And it is described with negative language. People suffer from autism, struggle with it, are affected by it. Who has autism, according to the British press? Collocates suggest that autistic individuals are children, and mainly boys. Only from 2015 onwards is girl a reliable collocate of autism, while after 2018, there are more diverse collocates suggesting that more diverse group of autistic people are associated with autism in the press. Autism is also listed with other neurodevelopmental conditions, as well as physical health conditions, mental health conditions, psychiatric conditions. One important theme in the emergent representations of autism is that a large proportion of articles show that autistic individuals suggest that autistic individuals do not speak directly. So this is especially evident in quotes referring to autistic children who are portrayed as being the ages, who are not portrayed as being the ages who initiated the actions in their own story. In the majority of cases, it is the mothers who initiate the described actions. So autistic children are presented as attributes of the mother, so a mother with an autistic child, or as being represented by the mother, or the reason for which a mother might take actions to improve the life of their child, or might be engaged in activism or advocacy to create a more accepting world for autism. Fathers are also there, but to a lesser extent. With regard to gender, as we said earlier, the great majority of stories involving autistic people feature young boys. Now, it is important to know that this is specific to autism, as there is no such bias for non-autistic children in the British press. Furthermore, our counts indicate that there is a slight move towards less gender bias in the press. So between 2011, the ratio of male and female collocates was 4:1, and this ratio was only 2.5 after 2018. In sum, we presented a corpus-based study of the representation of autism in the British press. This study demonstrates that there is an upward trend in the amount of representation, with substantial differences between individual newspapers. However, in terms of the quality of the representations are skewed towards the disability-based model. They use negative language, they present third-party accounts, and they have very strong male representation. There is some slow progress with regards to these issues. We are still involved in the analysis of our data. We will be soon organizing focus groups with members of the autism community, aiming to understand the implications of our findings and then come up with recommendations for reporting about autism and for practices and policies fostering a positive autistic identity. I would like to encourage everyone who would like to be involved to please get in touch. We also welcome queries and suggestions for analysis, which you can send them to our team, or if you want, you can just type them directly in the Q&A. I would like once again to thank our funders, as well as to acknowledge the work of my colleagues in the project, especially Dr. Ursula Marden-Weinberger, our research project assistant, and thanks also to our student intern, Mia Gris, and Professor Liz Pelicano for her continuing support with my research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Themis. That was really interesting to see. So we've got a Q&A now. So if Louise and Charlotte, you want to turn your cameras back on and join us. And just a final reminder, do submit any questions you have. We won't necessarily be able to get through all of them, but we'll do our best shot. And so the first question for you guys, again, same question I asked for last group, is just kind of what led you to your research and that topic. So Themis, you're in my top corner, so I'll start with you. Do you want to go?
Yes. Well, autism acceptance is such an important topic for the community. Personally, I started working on autism by studying perception. So I was looking at, I have conducted and am conducting studies that look at how autistic people, autistic perception sees the world differently. But as you are immersed in this research, you realize that the autistic community has a different sense about the priorities. It's such an important topic that addresses it. It has implications for their for mental health, for so many outcomes. So this was the primary reason. There's also a story related to the methods. As I was using corpus linguistics before, in other research, trying to understand language acquisition. So I was trying to work with theories that were using corpus linguistics to measure the linguistic environment. So in a way, this project brings together these two interests, and the COVID era, in which it was a little bit harder to test participants. It seemed like a nice period to develop this project.
Brilliant, thank you. Louise, what about you?
Well, I really believe and am keen that autistic voices should be heard for developing services, and I can tell you why that is. My background's education, and I was teaching in special schools, but I was moving schools, and I was going to be teaching in a class just of autistic youngsters. So over the summer holidays, I read absolutely everything I could possibly find about autism, and I knew all about theory of mind and executive function and central coherence and all that stuff, difficulties with social interaction. I walked into the classroom and thought, who are these children? These children are not anything like what I've been reading about, and so that was a revelation, and I realized that you have to understand or learn from the autistic people that you are hoping to support to support them in the right way. I'm also quite keen about relationship building as well, and relationships being two ways, and the double empathy and experiencing other people's views and perceptions and validating and not judging from your own perspective. So yes, I'm really keen on that subject. So that's why I'm here.
It's great you're able to bring all these threads kind of together in your research. Charlotte, what about you?
Well, for many of the reasons I've sort of explained in the presentation. So my background, I did my PhD on emotion and autism, which was extremely fascinating. And I joined the Generation Scotland team in about November, and a lot of my work at that point was focusing on the Teen COVID Life project and analysing the data we had from that. And I continued to sort of read about autism research in the background. And one thing I noted was that autistic voices themselves weren't really coming out in this research quite yet. It was a lot of caregiver report type stuff. And I thought, well, we have this fabulous data set with Teen COVID Life, and we have 80 autistic participants. It's not a massive sample, but it's enough to do something meaningful with. So I wanted to take the chance to try and get those young people's voices heard through analysing the data and discovering what they actually thought and actually felt about the pandemic.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. So Louise, firstly for you, we've had a couple of people, you might know the answer to this, you might not. It's more of a technical question than anything. It's about kind of, obviously your research was quite regional based. Do you know of similar networks, similar groups across the UK? Are they out there?
I don't know whether, because we developed our own model, so I don't know if other people are picking it up. I would love other people to pick it up. So if people out there are interested in setting up a Autism Champion network on this, using this model in their county, I think that'd be great. And also, I'd like to be ambitious. Also, if there are regional Autism Champion networks, it would be great for them all to link and have a national Autism Champion network. So that's my dream.
Let's hope. Charlotte, we've got a question for you about comorbidities or co-occurring mental health conditions like depression or anxiety. Do these get taken into account in your research and setting up the two groups or tested within the groups?
Unfortunately not. It was really something I went back and forth on when I was trying to do the analysis. We didn't really have clinical measures of depression and anxiety for multiple reasons. The core one being that with the teen COVID life being targeted at 12 to 17, we want to keep the survey relatively short and easy to complete. And these measures tend to be quite long and quite heavy in content. So that was ultimately part of the decision. I did think a lot about trying to match them up on resilience, but ultimately, even when you've got as many as 2,000 participants, trying to match on many, many variables becomes very difficult statistically to do and remain robust in other ways. So ultimately, that is a limitation of the analysis. We can't really look at the role of comorbid conditions, but it's definitely something worth exploring in future research.
Right, thank you. And Themis, we've got a question for you about kind of the types of media that you've been looking at. Have you thought about branching out, or did you kind of sideways look at other forms like social media, television, film in your research?
Yeah, for the moment, we focus our corpus linguistics paradigm or framework just to the news, just to the British press, not online documents. But yes, it's very important to extend beyond these, because these offer complementary accounts of autism identity and about the portrayal there. I guess what is specific about the news is that it has this. The press is that it is about a little bit. It has like the idea of providing information about this, so people tend to trust it. So it's quite constrained. It has some characteristics, but yes, a better study needs to extend more than this.
Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully it's gonna be in the future.
Excellent. Louise, I'm going to combo two questions here. So kind of how did you choose the autistic people to bring in and kind of be involved in your project? And how did you manage kind of differences in opinion or in approaches between these kind of diverse people to move forward?
An excellent question. I don't feel I really chose autistic people, or I think originally there were just autistic people I was chatting with and coming into contact with and said, would you be interested, would you like to be part of this? And people did think they'd give it a go. And then after that, those people seem to have told other people, and the word has spread. I've never really gone out and tried to press gang anybody and identify anybody in particular, and we would absolutely welcome everybody. we, in our explanation of it, we say anybody in the county, autistic person or with an autistic family member is very welcome to be part of this. We're absolutely not exclusive. We're as inclusive as we possibly can, and we would really want to have more representation, particularly, I suppose, ethnic groups and possibly the marginalized criminal justice experience, and people who have little or don't use language typically. So that would be another dream, another thing to be that we're thinking of and want to include, but it might be a little differently possibly than attending network meetings, adapt to what people feel happy doing. Yes, the next question is very good. I did mention it can be a bumpy ride. There's one meeting that sticks out in my head as being particularly difficult, and it was February 2020. So obviously people have their own opinions, and obviously things can be really emotive, and you've got deep-seated beliefs and knowledges, which is absolutely fine. And we absolutely respect everybody's view and validate, understand that that's their view, and it's all taken on board. It can be difficult, of course, when you've got that view and somebody else hasn't and doesn't seem to be getting it. But we did survive this particular meeting, and what I did actually was write everybody's views down, both Autism Champions and Autism Advisory Panel, because everybody, it wasn't just autistic people who were having difficulty seeing other people's viewpoints, it was absolutely everybody. So I did a table of the lists of the different viewpoints, and we actually sent it off to commissioning. So commissioning were aware that this was the general view in the county of particular issues. I don't know how you'd manage it any better than that, but it is about respect and it is about trust. And I don't think I would have even embarked on those questions if I didn't feel we had a trusting relationship within the network and were able to explore those issues that can be emotive.
Thank you. And it was, yeah, thank you for sharing an actual example of where it actually did come up. That's really interesting. Charlotte, so kind of given for what you've learned in your research and what your conclusions were, what do you think kind of the next step should be, whether in terms of future research, yours or other researchers, or in terms of actual practical takeaways, you know, things about what to do, easing restriction or future lockdown? What kind of things stood out for you?
That's really the million-dollar question, isn't it? I suppose that difficulty is from the golden rule, which is if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So one thing we're seeing in COVID-19 and pandemic research is that there's quite a lot of variability in how people are affected, and that is true of autistic adolescents as well. I think one thing that people need to be very mindful of moving forward is finding ways to make COVID-19 information very accessible. I was reading a paper recently that also suggests COVID-19 testing is very problematic for a lot of autistic people, both young people and adults. So making that more accessible is really key moving forward. And I think more work needs to be done to get uplift autistic voices and their experiences of the pandemic more. As I mentioned, we are getting quite a lot of interesting caregiver data, but we need to also look at what people are seeing themselves and what people need and what people think they'll need in the future, really.
Thank you. And a final question, and I'll direct this at Themis, but I might open it up afterwards, is kind of, you mentioned a shift in gender bias since kind of 2015, I think. And that media has becoming more interested in autism and women and girls. Did you find that kind of transgender or trans and gender topics became more associated with autism as part of this shift? I mean, we've seen anecdotally kind of links between them in media, especially around teenagers, trans teenagers. Is that something that came up in your research?
Yes, it did. It is there. We want to look a little bit more on this. Actually, one of the examples I had in my slides was for a case for a case like this, and I think it was actually an example of misgendering. So yes, it would be interesting to look at it because, yeah, on the one hand, this is something substantial in autistic people, but it's also interesting how it gets into the press and what is portrayed and what is said about this.
Thank you. And Charlotte, I know in your research, it was kind of, you had men, female, well, teens, and kind of those who, I can't remember what you put, other, or how you differentiated it, but you definitely had that kind of built into your research. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. In the Teen COVID Life database, in the Teen COVID Life survey, we did have a fair few. I want to say 2%, but don't quote me on that because I can't remember the stats off the top of my head. About 2% of teens were transgender, and quite a few of those identified as something other than male and female, whether that's non-binary or a different type of gender identity. And this rate was even higher when we look at the autistic teens, which holds up a lot of the wider research, which finds that there's autistic people are more likely to be transgender or more likely to have another LGBT identity. So unfortunately, the numbers were sort of too small in the data set to really do anything meaningful with in this data set. But one thing I want to make sure I did is when I did the nearest neighbour matching to factor in both sex and gender and to include trans and cisgender participants in the matching. But unfortunately, the numbers are just kind of too small to derive anything that meaningful with. I think you'd need to do a bit more of a dedicated study onto it.
Thank you. Louise, is this something that you came across much at all?
In our autism advisory panel, I suppose there are about 20 people, and one is transitioning at the moment. So I don't know if that says anything really. Out of 20 people, we have got one transitioning.
Well, thank you so much, the three of you, and for sharing your research and your questions and answers with us. It's been really interesting, and I know, kind of looking at the comments and on social media, that everyone has really enjoyed this session. So thank you so much for joining us.